Okay, so again, we're working with ratio tables here, which means I'm going to write each of these division problems as a ratio. So we can think of this as 4 to 1/2. So 4 of something for every 1/2 of something else. And we'll put some context to it. This would be 8 to 1. For example, you have an 8 to 1 winning streak. For every 8 wins, right, you have 1 loss. Here, this could be 32 for every 1/2. That's a ratio. And this could be thought of as 64 for every 1. We're just rewriting these as ratios. And then we'll set up a little ratio table here. And you can use all kinds of context here. I'm going to just use paint cans. So in one column, we have the number of cans of paint. And in the other, the portion or the amount of the wall covered. So our goal in every case is to cover the entire wall, or to finish the ratio. So if I start with 4 to 1/2, that means 4 cans of paint for every half of the wall covered. Well, how many cans of paint will it take to cover the entire wall? Well, I'm going to add 4 to this side, and I'm also going to keep the ratio going, add a half to this side. So it will take 8 cans of paint to fill the entire wall. And this is 8 to 1. Now this ratio can be thought of as, we can go back, since we started with 4 divided by a half, and I just substituted the ratio in for the division sign, I can do the reverse, can't I? I can rewrite this as 8 divided by 1. And what's 8 divided by 1? Well, that's just 8. So the answer here is 8. So you can just swap back and forth between the ratio sign and the division sign, which points out, oh, hey, the ratio for this is right here. So 8 to 1. That means we can substitute this as 8 divided by 1, right back to the beginning, and get 8. So notice that these two, right, have the same answer, and we'll come back to that as to why that makes sense. But let's just look at these two and see if there are similar connections here. What if I had 32 cans of paint and that covered half of the wall? How many cans of paint would it take to cover the entire wall? Again, I'm going to double this or add 32, I get 64. I'm going to double this or add a half, and that covers 1 full wall, which means this equals 64 to 1, right? And we can divide 64 by 1 and get 64, and that would be our answer. So here, this also can be represented as 64 divided by 1, going right back to the start, and that's just 64. So that could be our answer. So notice again, these two are the same. And you might want to think about why. One thing to point out is, well, once you have your ratio written as something to 1, you're done. So if we can write 4 divided by half as something to 1, we're done. And somehow we start to notice that 4, and we'll write it over here, 4 divided by a half is the same thing as 8, right, divided by 1. So somehow 4 divided by a half gives us 8 divided by 1, and 8 divided by 1 is just 8. So somehow 4 divided by a half is just 8. And you might see, oh, well, I know that 2 times 4 is 8. So that means that somehow, and this is where things get, I think, fun and interesting, 4 divided by a half is the same thing as 4 times 2. And that's something to think about. One way to think about it is within every whole number, within 1, for example, there are 2 1/2s. So if I want to know how many 1/2s are there in 4, well, every whole has 2. So I have 4 wholes, each of them with 2 halves, so 4 times 2 will tell me how many halves there are. So often division becomes as simple as taking your fraction and thinking about, well, how many times does that fraction go into a whole, and then counting the total. So if I have 4 wholes, each whole has 2 halves. 4 times 2 will give me how many halves there are altogether. Often this is reduced down to the simple step of taking 4 divided by, let's say, a over b, and what we get is that equals 4 times b over a. Notice all you're doing is flipping the fraction. So it would be, instead of 4 divided by a half, you get 4 times 2 over 1. That's called the reciprocal. And we'll talk more about that. And that applies in the next case. 32 divided by a half is the same thing as 32 times 2, which is 64. And this is something we'll play around with in the next couple of strings, but it's something that becomes intuitively obvious in our ratio tables, and we'll keep going.